예, 바쁘신 와중에
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for joining us for the parallel session 1 of the 2021 DMZ International Forum on the Peace Economy. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Jae-in from KIEP. Thank you very much. In this parallel session 1, which is organized by the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, we will be taking a look at the present and the future of the policy on the Korean Peninsula by assessing the Moon Jae-in administration and expectations towards the next administration. This session is being broadcast live on our YouTube channel. I'd like to ask for your support and interest until the end of the parallel session. If you have any questions, you may leave your questions or comments in the chat box. Then we will be able to have a Q&A session to cover your questions and carry on our panel discussion. Now, we would like to begin parallel session 1. The session will be moderated by Chancellor Hyunik of the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. We have a panel of 5 experts. They're going to be discussing the present and the future of the Korean Peninsula, and there will be a panel discussion. I will now hand over to Dr. Hong. Thank you. I am Hong Hyun-ik, and in the session we have with us a group of experts who will be assessing the achievements of the North Korean policies of the current administration. And in May next year, we will have a new government taking office, as we will soon have the presidential election. So we need to discuss the future direction of our North Korean policies. So here we have with us President Go Yu-hwan of the Korea Institute for National Unification, as well as many other experts. And here we are gathered in this hotel conference room to discuss the very important issues on the Korean Peninsula. I hope that you will find this panel, a parallel session, useful and insightful. There are many people who are watching us on YouTube. And if you have any questions to the experts or to me, then you may post your questions and we will be able to entertain some of them. So I'd like to ask for your active participation, and I hope that there will be many questions submitted by the audience. The current Moon Jae-in government has been carrying out its North Korean policies for more than 4 years. However, the situations on the Korean Peninsula have not been that easy because there's very strong strategic competition between the U.S. and China, and there is a suspension of inter-Korean dialogue. We need to address North Korean nuclear issues. However, there has been lack of progress, and there has been a suspension of talks between the U.S. and the DPRK. So in this situation, in September this year, President Moon Jae-in delivered a speech at the UN General Assembly, and he once again mentioned the necessity for an official end-of-war declaration. And he suggested that the U.S., China, and the 2 Koreas would need to officially declare the end of the Korean War, which was already proposed twice previously. And this obviously means that we need to find the momentum to revitalize the dialogue on the Korean Peninsula. Right now, the DPRK is basically closed down and is not opening its doors for dialogue. And we need to find a catalyst to bring back the DPRK to the negotiating table. We need to restore trust, and we need to do something about the current situation to resume dialogue. And that was the reason behind President Moon's proposal. And there has been some positive sign coming from North Korea, and China is rather positive about this proposal. But as for the U.S., there are some concerns that if the Korean War is officially over, North Korea may come to the dialogue table, But the implications of the end of war declaration would be quite huge in terms of the ROK-U.S. alliance, as well as the joint UN forces stationed in Korea, and other military implications may need to be considered. So there was no official position of the U.S. government on President Moon's demand, but there are some talks like this within the U.S. So it is basically a part of President Moon's effort to restore dialogue and pursue peace on the Korean Peninsula. So we would like to hear from the experts on these kinds of policies and efforts made by the Korean government. And at the same time, we would also like to hear from these experts based on their expertise, their views and positions and suggestions for the Korean Peninsula, and what kinds of policies do we need to pursue in order to build permanent peace here. So we have with us 5 experts. Let me introduce them in the order of the program. First of all, we have with us Dr. Jin Lee, who is a senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. So say hello. So she is a journalist. So she was stationed in North Korea. So she has extensive knowledge and experience about the inside workings of North Korea. Next, we have with us Professor Donggil Kim, joining us online from Beijing. He is Korean, but he's a professor at the Department of History at Peking University, a prestigious university indeed. And he's also serving as the director of the Center for Korean Peninsula Studies. Thank you. Next, representing Japan, we have Professor Lee Chanwoo of the Teikyo University, and he prepared a wonderful presentation. He went to college in Korea, and then he went to Japan, and then he continued on with his academic career. So, Professor Lee Chanwoo, thank you for joining us. Thank you. Next, from Russia, we have an expert on North Korea. And he's a well-known scholar here in South Korea as well. Whenever there is peace-related issue on the Korean Peninsula, he was one of the few experts who would offer us with insightful comments. So he has a lot of expertise. Dr. Alexander ZHEBIN, Director of the Center for Korean Studies. Thank you very much for joining us. And last but not least, whenever we have discussions on unification or the Korean Peninsula, you can often hear from him because he's a true expert, and he used to be a professor at Donggil University, but now president of the Korea Institute for National Unification, Dr. Yu-hwan. Thank you very much. So we have wonderful panel of 5 experts, and I will give each speaker 15 minutes to deliver their prepared comments. So each presenter will be given 15 minutes. I would first like to invite Ms. Lee.
Let's see if I can do this. Hello, everyone. I wanted to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to join this forum in person this year, despite all the hurdles required to bring an American to South Korea. And I want to thank our hosts, the organizer, and the support staff for all the hard work they've put into making this a successful and safe event. There's nothing like meeting in person to exchange ideas and to make connections. And I think it serves as a reminder of how much we are missing right now when we're so cut off from North Korea, whether that disconnect is from politics or due to policy or the pandemic. So let me see if I can do this. Before we turn to policy issues, I want to revisit history. We did this yesterday during our visit to the DMZ Museum, but I want to recognize the significance of holding this year's event so close to the DMZ near Goseong, a town that had been on the North Korean side before the division of the Korean Peninsula. And I want to thank President Kim, who explained this to me at dinner last night. Very interesting discussion about the history of the region. And I want to say that as an American journalist and analyst, as a Korean-American journalist and analyst, I think it's important to learn and lean on the history to provide the context and background that helps us make sense of everything that we're seeing unfold today and to map out the next steps for the future. And I wanted to mention that, I'm just going to go back to that picture. Let me see if I can do this. That many years ago, I was a journalist before I became an analyst, and many years ago as an AP bureau chief in Seoul, one of the first things I did was assign a reporter and a photographer to go to Kim Il-sung's villa in Goseong. It's just north of here. We passed it, I think, on our way yesterday to the DMZ Museum. And I wanted them to write about this summer villa in Hwajinpo for it to serve as a reminder of how fluid and sometimes arbitrary the dividing line between North and South was, and as a reminder of the shared history that the people in this region have with Goseong on the other side of the DMZ. And one thing that happened to me during that time, the time when I was in North Korea, and some of you who've been to North Korea may have been to that museum in Pyongyang, where they have an exhibition of the gifts that ethnic Koreans have given to the North Koreans throughout the years. This is a very unusual museum. Not very many people get to visit it. But this picture that I'm showing in this presentation, when you go to the villa, Kim Jong-il's face is scratched out. But the photo in Pyongyang is the original sent by the governor of Gangwon province at the time. So it was the first time I had seen the original picture. But the fact that the North Koreans had displayed it there was such an interesting little detail for me in the sense of shared history that the North Koreans feel as well. And similarly, we saw a little bit of this at the museum. This is a relic of the Workers' Party headquarters. I think it also serves as a reminder of that fluidity, that this region had been in North Korean hands, and that towns like Inje, just south of here, they may be in South Korea now, but they had been in North Korea before the war. And I often think about how the Koreans in this region were compelled to choose between the North Koreans and the South Koreans, the Soviet-supported North and the US-supported South. And this was just a generation or two, so my parents, my grandparents' generations. And how has that shaped the thinking of the people in this region? How does that history have a bearing on their children and their grandchildren, the future of South Korea? And how does that affect how they feel about North Korea and North Koreans? I think many of you who are South Korean know and understand this history, but for those of us in the United States, our understanding of history in Korea is shaped by the Korean War and particularly by the US-led military operation here. And so the accounts of what happened to the people of North Korea and South Korea, that often gets overlooked in the English language accounts. So in my own research and reporting, that is something that I've tried to focus on, is the impact of history, the Korean War, that it's had on the people of both North Korea and South Korea. I think what I'm saying is something very similar to what Ambassador Stevens was saying earlier in talking about the importance of returning power and agency to the people who were impacted by policy decisions often made in Washington. And so as a journalist, I would say that it's important for us to explore this history in English as well. I do want to mention, and I thought of this, President Kim, in our conversation yesterday, we have an archive, it's called the National Archives. Some of you may know about it. It's a research trove. US troops, as they went north, seized everything they could in North Korea. So you've got boxes upon boxes of documents that bear that history of the people of Korea up until the Korean War. So now moving on to policy. I think in the West, particularly in Washington, D.C., we tend to look at North Korea's actions through the filter of foreign policy. What message are the North Koreans trying to send us? What are they reacting to in Washington, in Seoul, and elsewhere? What can we do in Washington, in Seoul, to compel a different set of actions in Pyongyang. But having spent so many years in Pyongyang, I tend to focus on what's happening inside the country that might be driving the leadership's decision-making. This is a picture that I took at the flower show. Many of you will have been to these similar flower shows. And so as we debate current and future policy on the Korean Peninsula, including what to expect in the remaining months of the Moon administration, what might lie ahead with the new government that takes office in a few months' time, I may defer to my fellow panelists to discuss and assess South Korean policy. And what I'd like to focus on today is analysis of what might be happening in North Korea, and to provide some viewpoints from Washington, where we're nearly 1 year now into a Biden administration. So we may not be on the ground in North Korea, but if I were there, I think what we would find is that everything right now is devoted to preparing for the 10-year anniversary of Kim Jong-un's rule. As we know, these milestone anniversaries are excessively significant to North Korean propaganda and to cementing the legacy of Kim family rule. It's a major anniversary for Kim Jong-un, and it comes at a time of hardship. And so these celebrations will be designed to reinforce a sense of unity and to compel the North Korean people to rally around Kim Jong-un. And what this means is that every decision will be made with this objective in mind, including foreign policy. The emphasis will be on shaping the narrative around Kim Jong-un and making sure that there are no surprise elements to upset the making of history and expanding the Kim family mythology. So there are, of course, many surprise elements that could upset the picture that the regime wants to paint, but perhaps the most unpredictable is the COVID pandemic. And I suspect that the last thing the leadership wants right now is an uncontrollable COVID outbreak that would prevent them from setting the stage for these anniversary celebrations. So keeping the border closed to human traffic may be part of that strategy. You know, in addition, of course, to serving as a preventative method to keep the pandemic at bay, it also has the added benefit of allowing the regime to control the flow of information. This does, of course, come at the expense of imports and exports of many of the basic items that every society needs to function: food, medicine, aid, fuel, supplies, and this is certainly true for North Korea. And yet, the leadership will want to prepare for celebrations that traditionally include gifts for the people, perhaps in time for the April festivities. So I think we may see an increased effort to try to secure the goods that they would like to win the people's loyalty in these gift boxes that they receive typically in April. And so as the border closures drag on, we also may see some allies try to find ways to help North Korea with basic supplies, to avoid seeing the company fall into further economic disarray, and perhaps also to try to entice Pyongyang out of isolation. We may not have access now, but I think it's safe to say that the economic situation will have worsened over the past 2 years, and that raises the stakes for any moves that North Korea makes going forward. So I did want to mention that my current research is focusing on examining the role that science and technology play in Kim Jong-un's leadership strategy. This curiosity grew from my time on the ground during the early years of his rule and seeing a narrative built around his ability to lead North Korea into the future using science and technology. But I couldn't help but wonder if there might be another side to this calculation and to this push for modernization. And that question became the basis for the BBC podcast series, The Lazarus Heist. It looks at not only how North Korea is believed to be using cyber as a form of asymmetric warfare, but also as a way to make money. And I think for me, the question is not only how they did it, but why. It's important for us to understand their motivations and to understand what the implications are. And the rise in the use of cyber warfare by North Korea, I think it obviously has broad implications. And I won't have time to get into that today. But in this context, I think we should be looking more closely at how much higher the stakes are for the North Koreans at a time when the borders are closed and traditional methods of making money are limited by sanctions. North Korea is believed to have amassed about $2 billion from cyber attacks over the years, so it's not an insignificant amount. So in my podcast series, we examined the attempt to steal $1 billion from a cyber attack on the Bangladesh bank alone. And I would be honored if you would listen to it and perhaps offer some questions and feedback as we continue down this path of exploring the impact of cyber, not only on our security, but also on how North Korea raises its funding and where it goes. And I do think we need to consider the consequences of that money going towards supporting the continued development of North Korea's nuclear arsenal. I think for the time being, nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles will remain a priority, with the payoff inspiring a sense of pride and unity among North Koreans. They are genuinely proud that their small country that they've been able to build these weapons. And I think these tests and these provocations also serve as a reminder to the world of the threat that their program poses. So we will see these provocations from time to time going forward. I expect continued advancements in preparation for eventual nuclear negotiations with the United States. But I think we should remember that the interval between the Hanoi talks in 2019 and the next negotiations, whenever they may be, will also mean that North Korea will continue to expand its capability. Just trying to look at my timer. So looking ahead, I think President Moon understood and correctly calculated that Kim Jong-un would respond to summits that would give him the legitimacy that he craves. Those summits did provide Kim Jong-un with some elements that he wanted. He needed to show his people that he is a leader of international stature, and he got that with all those high-profile summits. That is something that his grandfather and his father never managed to do, was to sit down with a US president. And he will forever be able to claim that. But that alone isn't enough to carry out his vision for lasting rule and stability. For that, he needs a lasting nuclear deal that will both buttress North Korea's flailing economy and lead to a transformation of the relationship with the United States that would allow him to shift focus to a different kind of future. So the question, could an end of war declaration be a step in that direction? On the one hand, I think that a declaration could provide another propaganda moment for Kim Jong-un at a time when he's seeking to cement his legacy in a milestone year. And I do think that he and his people want to move past their militarized lifestyle, militarized society, to one that's more focused on civilian life. But the tensions provide the rationale that he needs for pouring scarce resources into nuclear weapons. And I don't think Kim feels it's time yet to abandon that position. Minister Lee mentioned that a declaration could remove the rationale for tensions. But it would be a huge sacrifice for Kim Jong-un to give up an approach that has worked so well for the Kim family over the decades. I do believe that President Moon is looking for a kind of Hail Mary, as we say in the United States, in the last months of his presidency. But I think that President Biden has made clear that while he's open to meeting with Kim Jong-un, it will be part of a diplomatic process, one that would not be granted at the start of negotiations, as with his predecessor, President Trump. So I think we need to take a step back and look at the Biden administration's approach to foreign policy in the region and look at that larger goal that they hold, which is addressing strategic competition with China. And I think North Korea policy is going to be one component, or is one component, of that broader strategy on how to deal with China, not the key driver of it. And so I think we need to pay close attention to the administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, which does entail restoring and shoring up relationships with allies, and also looking for areas where the US and its allies can work with China. And perhaps one of those areas is North Korea. This is a process that will take time and it will require patience. which I recognize the Moon administration may not have with just a few months left in office. And it will be left then to the next administration in Seoul. I do think that the May summit between President Moon and President Biden did set the stage for a continued robust alliance with whoever takes office in Seoul in the spring. And I think Kim Jong-un may be waiting to see what happens with this transition. So we may need to exert patience in the meantime, setting up a strategy of unity within the region with partners coming together for an eventual multilateral negotiation. Thank you so much.
신리 선생님.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lee, for your wonderful presentation. So she shared with us her view on the Korean Peninsula from the American perspective. And she also mentioned about the significance of the end of war declaration, while we can expect some headwinds along the way. Next, I would like to hear from the Chinese perspective, which is as important to us as the American perspective. So I'd like to invite Professor Kim Donggil, Director of the Center for Korean Peninsula Studies at the Peking University. He will be able to share with us what China is thinking right now concerning the Korean Peninsula, including the two Koreas and the US. So now I'd like to invite Professor Kim. Hello. Thank you very much, Dr. Hong, for the kind introduction. When you think about the Chinese perspective, it is rather pessimistic, not optimistic, because on the Korean Peninsula, especially given the worsening US-China strategic competition, where there's a lot of change taking place inside China, as you may know very well, it is not easy to predict the Korean Peninsula policies of the Chinese government. It is not easy to understand what they are thinking. But recently, when you take a look at some of the research discussions, you can find some significant changes of the perceptions in China. Currently, China is arguing that there is a major transformation and transition in the global order. So now at this time, when you look at some of the strategic discussions, they argue that the US and China are no longer in the strategic competition, but rather now they are in the strategic confrontation stage. So this confrontation is expected to continue for a long time. But next year, as we only have December left before the end of this year, next year in 2022, the key priority for China is, of course, to deal with the strategic confrontation with the US while dealing with the pandemic. And the third term of Xi Jinping will begin. And there are other domestic issues, including Uyghur and the Taiwan Strait. So compared to these more important domestic issues, the North Korean nuclear issues and the Korean Peninsula are less priorities for the Chinese government. And as the Sino-US relations are getting worse, and as the US is trying to keep China in check, China is getting more interested in working with North Korea in response to the pressures coming from the US. Before President Trump, China was in a position of working together with the US to stabilize the Korean Peninsula by having North Korea give up its nuclear weapons. And to make this happen, China was quite supportive, and China was active in sponsoring and supporting the UN sanctions and other sanctions. So you can see that China was rather supportive of the US UN sanctions. But after President Trump, things changed fundamentally because China had to change its direction. They used to pursue stability on the Korean Peninsula by forcing North Korea to give up its nuclear programs, but now it's not mentioned anymore. And now the Chinese government believes that denuclearization is rather a long-term goal, not an immediate objective. But instead, they are paying a keen attention to what's happening with Quad, and their top priority is to prevent South Korea from joining the Quad because they do not want South Korea to be closer to that kind of alliance. So the policy of utilizing the UN sanctions to force North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons is not going to work anymore because there's a change of attitude in China. Also, there are several preconditions, actually 4 preconditions that China argues that need to be met for denuclearization. In the Republic of Korea right now, we're talking about armistice treaty and end of war declaration. But in China, they argue that the armistice treaty has to be replaced by a peace treaty. And also normalization of relations between the 2 Koreas as well as the DPRK and the US need to be done as preconditions for denuclearization. But as you may understand, in reality, these are not going to be realistic. 30 years ago, both Koreas joined the UN, so at that time there was a better mood. But now, the US and Japan do not have official diplomatic relations with DPRK, so there's no diplomatic normalization between the DPRK and the US and Japan. In addition, we have the armistice treaty still under. So we have the armistice treaty, and it's been more than 70 years, and we have the joint UN forces stationed in Korea, and the US forces have the control, military control, which are not normal. So unless these conditions are changed, denuclearization may not take place. So these are the kinds of positions by China that have forged after 2018. And the second precondition that China is arguing for denuclearization is related to the economic sanctions. China argues that economic sanctions need to be lifted gradually. And they argue that we need to engage North Korea and include North Korea as part of the international community before we can carry out efforts for denuclearization. And to do so, we need to lift economic sanctions on a gradual basis. That's the argument of China. And China is saying that these UN sanctions are actually serving as obstacles to the denuclearization process. Also, as was mentioned, Chinese people think that denuclearization cannot be done in any major deal or one comprehensive deal or package, but the denuclearization process will have to be carried out in a gradual manner. And in this regard, the joint military exercises between the US and ROK need to be suspended permanently. And all these military exercises should be stopped, and the THAAD missile defense system should be abolished. And any attempts to station long-range missiles in South Korea should not be implemented because these are posing military tensions and threats to China and the surrounding nations. Furthermore, China is arguing that we first need to get rid of the legacy of the Korean War and the Cold War on the Korean Peninsula. And so, in this regard, China is arguing that the mutual defense treaty between the US and the ROK needs to be replaced by a peace treaty that does not include military elements. So when we have these treaties in place, the US DPRK relations cannot be improved in the way that the US-Vietnam relations were improved in the past. So these are the four major preconditions that China is arguing before we can achieve denuclearization. However, these four preconditions were raised after President Trump took office. And as long as China continues to demand these four preconditions to be met before denuclearization, it will be very difficult to engage China in the process of denuclearization. And furthermore, the worsening relations between the U.S. and China will continue to prolong the concerning situations in the Korean Peninsula for a long time. Now, let's take a look at the shift of policy attitudes towards the Korean Peninsula in China. Before President Trump, China's position was to work with the U.S. to control North Korea. So that was the basic attitude. The basic position was that China would be working with the U.S. to keep North Korea at bay. But now it has been reversed. Now China believes that it has to work with the DPRK to resist and respond to the U.S. And these kinds of adjustments are demanded by researchers and many government authorities in China. And furthermore, they're saying that China has to work with Russia as well as the DPRK to respond to the U.S. and to resist the U.S. These may not be in the form of an alliance per se, but they say that China has to work closely with closely with the DPRK and Russia. And the most concerning aspect about the Korean Peninsula in China is not the nuclear issue, but rather they are concerned that potentially the U.S. may use South Korea as a tool to keep China in check, because they're paying a keen attention to whether the Republic of Korea will join Quad or not, and whether long-range missiles would be stationed in Korea to target China. So these are the kinds of concerns that China is paying a keen attention to. So the question of whether China will help us for denuclearization or not, this may have to do with whether these military plans of the U.S. to station these missiles in Japan and Korea, China does not want Korea to join the Quad, and they don't want any of these missiles to be stationed in China, in Korea or Japan. So these are the kinds of key priorities or policy priorities for China right now. If the U.S. installs long-range missiles in Korea, then China may become very aggressive in responding to this. And also, it may be possible that China would also put together missiles in defense of these missiles of the U.S. And there may be some discussions of economic sanctions on individuals as well as organizations and manufacturers of ballistic missiles if such missiles are stationed in South Korea. And China would argue that China would work with the DPRK and Russia to respond to these. And actually, you can say that China and Russia are becoming closer in terms of their strategic interests. Then what can we do in the situation? As I mentioned earlier, North Korea actually promised that it would denuclearize it if there's no perceived threat from the U.S. So China would argue that China would want to form a strategic partnership with North Korea so that they will become partners in responding to and resisting the U.S. And they may develop some weapons with North Korea, and they may also help economic development of North Korea in some of the special economic zones. So this means that China may be actively supporting North Korea. As there is growing pressure on China from the U.S., China emphasizes that the DPRK should be China's very important strategic partner. And furthermore, they may argue that they could sell weapons to North Korea and provide some economic assistance. Secondly, while China strengthens its relations with the DPRK, China would also wish to strengthen its relations with South Korea as well, so that South Korea will not join the Quad. We will have to wait and see whether the Republic of Korea would be able to continue to resist this invitation to Quad. We will have to see what the presidential election will result in, and there may be some change, the possibility of change of government from a more liberal government to a more conservative government. So we will have to wait and see and what happens. But one of the top priorities of China is to prevent or keep South Korea from joining the anti-China alliance of the U.S. So that is actually a very top priority for China. So I believe that China may want to persuade South Korea and talk to South Korea so that South Korea will not join the Quad. The current approach of China may be similar to the position of China 70 years ago of resisting the U.S. aggression by aiding North Korea. 70 years ago, this position was pushed forth by the government, but now many scholars and experts inside China are arguing for the need to align with North Korea to respond to the competition coming from the U.S. Now, in these circumstances, Korea needs to play a bigger role because Korea is number 10 in terms of its economy and number 7 in terms of military. So China does not want the Republic of Korea to be part of the U.S. alliance against China because it is going to pose even greater threat to China. And at the same time, even though China wishes to align closer with North Korea, this may cause some other implications. So it is not going to be that easy. And there are several policy matters that have some implications on its relations with the U.S. Kim Jong-un is rather open-minded in some sense compared to Xi Jinping maybe, and between the two Koreas, it is unfortunate that the inter-Korean relations have not improved during this administration, even though the current administration was able to prevent any major military provocations from taking place. But it is rather unfortunate that we were not able to make even more progress. So maybe we need to change our approach maybe because the status of Korea has improved a lot. And we need to keep that in mind. And we have to recognize that Korea has its capabilities and its resources, and it has a higher status right now in the international community. And so there is a greater role that Korea can play, not only for the U.S., but also for China. Korea can exercise its carrot and stick strategy that has been used by the U.S. and China, but now Korea is strong enough and powerful enough to be able to utilize both carrot and the stick. And so in this regard, the Korean government will have to exercise more influence. In other words, going forward in the future, depending on what the Korean government does, the strategic competition between the U.S. and China may actually give Korea more opportunities to explore other possibilities. Thank you for your attention.
네, 김동길 선생님.
Yes, thank you, Professor Donggil Kim. I sent my appreciations, but I am slightly concerned because you mentioned that the U.S. may not put top priority on solving North Korea, and the currently dialogue is at a standstill. And because China, because the issue is focused on them, they also believe that the North Korean issue will not be solved overnight. And so they may focus on strengthening their ties with North Korea, which means that solving the nuclear issue on North Korea will not be easy because of the low interest from Washington and also because of Beijing's view that this will not be solved overnight, which means that everyone will will essentially have low priority on solving this, which may mean that the reality that we want is not around the corner. So that was quite sombering. Now we'd like to turn to Mr. Lee Chanwoo, who is joining us from Japan. He graduated from Seoul National University, studied Japanese studies. He also worked with Daewoo Research Center, and he studied in Japan. And he's currently a professor at Keiko University, and is also a head fellow at the Korean Studies Institute at that university. And because he has high expertise regarding North Korea, I'm sure that we will be hearing a lot of insight. You have 15 minutes, Dr. Lee. Yes, hello. I am Lee Chanwoo with Teikyo University in Japan. First of all, allow me to extend my gratitude to all of you. And it's a great honor for me to be here representing my university, Teikyo University. And today I will be sharing my views regarding the assessment of the Moon administration. But because I am here in Japan, I will also share with you the perspectives that we have here in Japan as well. Allow me to go through the material that I have prepared. Yes. I don't know if you can see the slide. Yes, there we are. So I want to focus my presentation on the assessment on the Moon administration. But I also believe that when I listened to the previous speaker, it provided me with some insight on how Japan views the issue. Because I think that my perspective is 180% different from what Mr. Kim said earlier. I think that's what the Japanese government thinks about the issue. So if you turn around the thoughts of the other parties, that's what you get in Japan. Japan feels that there needs to be a sense of defending against the various threats. And to Japan, that feels extremely offensive, which means that they are in the complete opposite position of China. So that's what I want to tell you before I go into my presentation. Here on this slide, I wanted to share with you the assessment of the peace policy of the Moon administration, as well as some future ways to move forward regarding the peace policy. Because I don't have that much time, I just want to underscore the important parts of each slide. President Moon focused on the issues of both security and peace. So it was a quite ambitious goal to catch both birds with one stone. So the ultimate goal, the exit point, was to create a peace economy. And they wanted to do that through security based on peace. And that was the stance over the past 4 years. But the problem is with regards to the practicality of all of this and whether the administration was able to persuade neighboring countries to jump on board. If this kind of a peace initiative was to work, you first of all need to have a favorable environment, and also you need to make sure that this was led and driven by the two parties. And third, it had to be objective or accepted by neighbors. But I believe that these three conditions were not in place. You may have heard of the policy visions, the 3 goals, the 4 strategies, and the 5 principles. And these were the conditions that the Moon government put forth in order for a peace economy or a peace initiative. It was very ambitious to begin with. And this led to the Panmunjom Declaration, as well as the Joint Declaration. And up until 2018, the international community was taken aback by what was happening on the Korean Peninsula, particularly Japan, to see how South Korea was taking the lead and also persuading North Korea to join on board. It was like South Korea was in the driving seat. The problem was what happened after 2019. Because I think at that point, the South Korean government hit a wall, so to speak, and I think that's a general assessment in Tokyo. The new economic initiative on the Korean Peninsula, the East Asia Railway Community Initiative, these plans and initiatives that were put forth were the so-called Korean Peninsula Dreams. And so in Northeast Asia, there was a dream of economic cooperation taking place between the relevant parties. But when we think of this, I think that there are various perspectives that exist. If we look at the history of the Korean Peninsula, the Korean Peninsula is a very unique region in that there is internationality and nationality crossing and mixing. There's also a forced division and identity conflict existing at the same time. So there is, on the one hand, efforts to continue negotiation and dialogue, while on the other hand, there are efforts to keep each other at bay. And they have been doing this for several decades now. So in the future, also, I think that we need an international perspective, and the issue also has to be resolved through an international method, although, of course, the two Koreas need to take the lead. So it's very complex. It's like solving a very difficult mathematical formula almost. So during the past 4 years and a half, let's see how well the Moon government did in solving this mathematical formula. I, first of all, don't think that they were that well prepared, particularly in the fact that they were unable to secure a firm understanding from related partners like Japan and the US. So there may have been some progress with relations with North Korea directly, but overall, they were unable to keep all of their neighbors on board, which led to these various difficulties. I think the basic principle that the government had was consistent, but I think they hit a wall with regards to the realities. And so first of all, in 2018, they said that they need to stand alone. And then in 2019, there was a call for international cooperation. And then they went back and forth. So there was a bit of a crisis in how they maintain their continuity. And also, I think when we look at North Korea, they also had their own challenges. There was also some lack of continuity in the principles and policies that North Korea set forth. So on the one hand, they wanted diplomatic measures, diplomatic resolutions, which was made possible through small deals, but then they had to resort to their traditional methods of nuclear and missile capabilities as they decided to just take this face on. And in this process, one case that we saw, one example we saw, was South Korea being unable to reverse the 2010 principles and restrictions that they had imposed. Because there is the UN sanctions imposed on North Korea, the one-sided May 24th measures were unable to be reversed. So South Korea was able to use that negotiating card. And so this is one analysis that we put forth. There were some restraints also that the Moon government faced. First, internationally, I believe that there were quite some restraints. While there were some progress on the economic front, there existed challenges regarding geopolitical situations. And the US and Japan had a lot of concern towards China. And the conflict within the Indo-Pacific led to various conflicts. And so the North Korean policy of South Korea was constrained because of these various trends. And you may know this map, but because of the expansion of China, the US and Japan felt that they needed to keep this at bay. And so there are various efforts to constrain China, starting from the Korean Peninsula way down to Taiwan. And because of this geopolitical understanding, this led to a consolidation of the division on the peninsula, and Japan was all behind this. And in this aspect, as Professor Kim mentioned earlier, I think that China has a certain view towards North Korea, which goes completely against what the US and Japan feel. And in this aspect, I think Japan feels that it has to keep its position against China and creating laws and institutions that allow its self-defense forces to conduct various activities in the Indo-China Sea. And Japan feels that this is necessary to maintain some security in the maritime territory of this region. And I think this kind of a perspective is becoming stronger. Also, Japan was therefore it expanded its policy from Northeast Asia to the Indo-Pacific. And its policies, therefore, have skewed more towards US and therefore its independence with regards to these diplomatic policies have become more difficult to find. With regards to the economy and security, you can see that they want to maintain its relationship with South Korea to keep North Korea at bay, but they also have interest in GSOMNIA and other military cooperation to keep North Korea at bay. And also, historically, there have been various issues with South Korea. So it has continued to try to keep South Korea at bay and at control. But you can see that the Moon government was more liberal, which made it lean towards China or North Korea more. And this was viewed very negatively in Japan. And I think this played a role in souring the relations with South Korea. But also, we share the views of democracy and a free economy, and so they have focused on these core values. So there have been these views to embrace Korea by focusing on these shared values. So because of time, I'd like to skip this slide and move on to the next one. So along with these international forces, another constraint to the Moon government's peace policy was the factor of North Korea. The choices that North Korea has made has played a role in turning the situation around. They have pointed fingers saying that Korea has not kept its promises and that they wanted to deal directly with Washington. And I think that is something that put a wedge between the two Koreas. Up until 2017, China sometimes clashed with North Korea, but ever since 2018, you can see North Korea changing its stance and is trying to make China lift the various sanctions that they had. After the 2018 Pyeongchang Olympics, when there was a thaw in the ties and some of the tensions were lifted, you could see that there was a system where an environment where North Korea, South Korea, the US, and Japan were collaborating. And this, of course, was not taken well by China. And I think that is what led China to warm up to North Korea and provide its support to make sure that North Korea could not become chummy with the other neighbors. And this provided the various conditions for a new Cold War. And I think that is what led North Korea to take that kind of a geopolitical choice. And this is something that is lasted until 2021. So you also have to realize that the inter-Korean conflict is not something that has been caused just by a one-sided decision, but it's a very complex and multifaceted because it has been affected by various variables, and we have seen how this has influenced the various situations within North Korea, including its economic situation. Currently, North Korea has closed its borders, also has closed its economic routes, and it seems that it's trying to face the situation head on, which of course is risky. But there are social, economic, and military situations that they take in place. And although there is some challenges, crises, I don't believe that this is a direct crisis to the regime per se. The peace policy of South Korea has had some influence on North Korea because of perhaps the cultural policies that they have taken? We have to ask this kind of a question. And there are North Korean residents, of course, aspiring towards to leaving North Korea and joining the South. We have to question if that actually happened. But in actual fact, if we look at the figures, we don't see that happening. It wasn't a significant or substantial wave or change. So we can say that the peace initiative of the Moon government did not work that effectively to undermine the situation in North Korea, and it could actually enable the North Korean society to choose more riskier options. So overall, I believe that the peace policy was perhaps no more than a declaration or words. And this is, first of all, because of political factors. Because internationally, South Korea was neither pro-U.S. and it didn't seem very independent. Its policy stance was not very convincing, and there were forces that protested against the various peace policies, both within Korea as well as Japan and the U.S. And I think this led to a lot of confusion with regards to the policy lines. Then there were some factors in North Korea. North Korea perhaps was a bit negative towards this policy because they felt that this was an initiative that tried to undermine the system and lead to regime collapse, which made them very reluctant to engage in exchange and cooperation. So we did not see a lot of fruit in various aspects as we saw in the past. Then what kind of a expectation can we have for the upcoming or the new government? I believe that they need to be more proactive in coming up with a policy that fits the international environment, and also they need to come up with a policy that can also target the so-called Chinese-led continent bloc, as well as the democratic bloc. And also, they need to have a firm conviction that bringing about peace on the Korean Peninsula is something that is non-negotiable. It's something that we have to do. And in the long term, I think that denuclearization should be an exit point for any kind of a peace policy. And so denuclearized Korea and talks towards that should be pursued through the U.S., but also the two Koreas have to be at the center. There could also be military talks, security-related dialogue. This is somewhere that they could start. Or they could also focus on the values of democracy and economic development. And they could focus on these areas of common prosperity. And so in these areas, I think that there could be efforts to bring about some common ground. And these three areas is something I believe that could be conditions for future peace policies. Also, in these international conditions, I think that these four factors need to be kept in mind. So the network or the system within Asia should be consolidated, whereas we could use RSF or other forums within Asia, such as the ASEAN, and involve other neighbors. So it needs to be a realistic and more practical approach that incorporates its neighbors and also secures a initiative role, a leadership role driven by the two Koreas. I don't have that much time to go into details, but with these three pillars, such as cooperation on logistics and industry, and also cooperation between people, and also a security paradigm, I think that these are the three pillars that we could focus on for a more productive policy. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. Your presentation was very comprehensive because you went through the entire situation over the Korean Peninsula. You made an assessment. You focused on issues and also pointed towards the future. I wanted to give you a question. In the concluding remarks, you mentioned that Korea could come up with a system of recovery with other players ahead of the U.S., but would that actually work? That is to say, the Korean government has worked very hard for multilateral cooperation, and military talks with North Korea were initiated, but North Korea did not come to the table. So will North Korea come to the table if Korea tries to propose this? So please share your views on that final point. Thank you. Now let's move on to the next speaker.
We're going to hear from an expert from Russia. We have with us Dr. Alexander ZHEBIN. He has an interesting background because from 1978 till 1990s, he was part of the TASS media. So he was a TASS correspondent in Pyongyang, and also he conducted study at the Unification Institute. So he's actually very extensively knowledgeable about the North Korean cases and the Korean Peninsula. So please go ahead. Thank you very much.
I would like to express my sincere thanks to National Research Council for Economic, Humanities and Social Sciences, to Korean Institute for International Economic Policy, and Kanwando provincial government for inviting me for this very timely and important conference, which deals with the strategy of Korean people, Korean division, and of course there are different views and positions concerning how to solve this situation. I try to present some personal vision, which is part of the Russian vision of the situation, and ways how to improve it. First of all, the main conclusion that could be done and drawn from the recent events on the Korean Peninsula is that the priority given to pressure and sanctions approach for the solution of North Korea nuclear and missile issue has proved to be wrong. It is impossible to deny the cause has failed to achieve the aims his supporters had declared, the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. On the contrary, when faced with such an attitude, North Korea during the 2017 period conducted 6 nuclear tests and finally succeeded in launching 2 satellites, and has become de facto a nuclear power. A famous saying by Albert Einstein on futility of attempts to do the same thing and expect different results, different answers, once again had been proven in Korea. Meanwhile, Experience of dealing with North Korea testifies that excessive pressure and coercion had led in majority of cases to greater suspicion and hostility, while engagement and respect for certain positions shaped by history legacies brought about cooperation and compromise. The results of 5 inter-Korean summits and other inter-Korean talks, experience of practical interaction between North and South have proved that the compromise is possible if both sides have political will and can reach it and implement it. Sure, North Korea not an easy partner to deal with. We in Russia know that maybe better than anyone else because we have the longest history of bilateral relations. But if the military option isn't excluded, any political solution is not possible without certain compromise. The rather long history of inter-Korean economic cooperation testifies that this is a very existent and important channel. Both sides are ready to restart immediately. It is highly likely that more active involvement of North Korea in economic process and economic cooperation may bring about positive changes in her international behavior. Lessons of German unification, downfall of socialism in East Europe, and regime change scenarios imposed by United States and its allies on the Balkans, in Iraq and Libya alarmed North Korean leaders. Unless North Korean elite would be provided with a clear guarantees that of their personal safety, adequate social status, and certain level of well-being after unification, it would stay united and remain very reluctant to open the country and to abandon the nuclear weapons. Only inviting in honest North Korea to participate in the realization of inter-Korean and multilateral economic projects in Northeast Asia, including those proposed by Russia, can convince Pyongyang that the international community had taken on a road leading to North Korea gradual and peaceful integration in existing international political and economic order instead of forcing on the country a regime change scenario. Economic cooperation will help to develop North Korea economy, to make North Koreans more prepared to live in a modern society. In other words, it will help to lessen the existing gap between two parts of the country and to cut unification costs. During the process, it will help to engage in North Korea ever-growing strata of people interested in a stable and cooperative relations with outside world. A few words about Russia's position on inter-Korean cooperation. Russia also welcomed all moves by two Korean states aimed at relaxation of tension and promoting inter-Korean cooperation because of several major considerations. Moscow hopes that inter-Korean reconciliation, first of all, will remove a threat of military conflict right next to the Russian borders. Secondly, Russia believes that improvement of inter-Korean relations would open new opportunities for economic development of the Russian Far East region. And thirdly, promote more difficult environment for both development of Russia bilateral economic relations with two Korean states, as well as for implementation of multilateral economic projects with Russia's participation in Northeast Asia. Besides being economically advantageous for all participants, such interaction is highly likely to contribute to the confidence building between South and North Korea. Moscow believes that North Korea's decision to refrain from nuclear tests and ICBM launches, along with some other conciliatory moves and steps recently, should be rewarded by lifting of at least some sanctions, especially those which negatively influence people living and hinder economic development, pressing other countries to strictly abide with North Korea-related United Nations security resolutions. United States sometimes forgetting that the same resolutions directly call for lifting of sanctions if North Korea understands such conciliatory steps. Just a minute. I don't. What are the urgent tasks in this field? First of all, it is achieving full sovereignty of. It is necessary to ensure full sovereignty of South and North Korea in inter-Korean relations, in accordance with the provision of 1972 Joint Statement and North-South Declaration of June 15, 2000. Restoration of principle of separation of politics from economics in inter-Korean relations. Transition to a policy of peaceful coexistence as a necessary historical period of interaction between North and South on the way to their peaceful reunification. Third, the signing of the declaration on the end of Korean War, the transfer of control over the demilitarized zone entirely into the hands of two Korean sides, who will independently, without any outside interference, have right to determine the order of movement of people and goods through the demilitarized zone in order to freely implement inter-Korean exchanges and cooperation. Fourth, lifting United Nations Security Council sanctions and unilateral sanctions imposed by a number of states, including this country, that hinder the establishment of inter-Korean trade, economic and investment cooperation, humanitarian, cultural, sport, and other exchanges between North and South Korea. Reopening of Kaesong Industrial Park and Kimgansan Tourist Zone. Resumption of work on the implementation of projects connecting Korean railways and Chinese railways with each other. Creating social, mass media, and cultural environment favorable for and encouraging inter-Korean reconciliation and cooperation, refraining from demonizing and naming each other. In conclusion, I would like to bring your attention to the fact that ongoing suspension of negotiation process on the nuclear problem provide North and South Korea with a new and unique chance through their own combined efforts to seize leadership in removing threat of another major conflict on the peninsula, promoting peace and common prosperity. 3 inter-Korean summits of 2018 confirmed that inter-Korean dialogue has a huge potential to become a major engine for promoting security and stability on the Korean Peninsula. The dialogue is vitally necessary to improve the current uneasy situation in inter-Korean relations. The best options for the Koreans, both in the North and in the South, would be to resume working on implementation of the bilateral agreements and understandings reached between South and North Korea at the various talks and contacts held during several recent decades, including those agreed upon at the 3 historical inter-Korean summits held in 2018. It is high time for the Koreans, both in the North and in the South, to take the destiny of their nation, of the Koreans as a nation, in their own hands. Kamsahamnida. Thank you.
네, 재빈 선
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jae-in. With that, we have heard from the 4 neighboring countries surrounding the Korean Peninsula on how they feel about the current situation on the Korean Peninsula and also how these countries view the Moon government's North Korean policies. Now we'll be hearing from what we feel in Korea. And this will be presented by Dr. Ko. And after his presentation is over, we don't have that much time left over. So I think that we will be briefly discussing how we should proceed in the future. So Dr. Ko will be giving a presentation. He taught North Korean studies at Donggil University. He was also a policy advisor to the presidential office and also was a visiting fellow to various world-renowned universities and currently is a president at the Korea Institute for National Unification. So Dr. Ko will also be sharing his assessment. I just want you to share your assessment on the status quo, and let's leave the part of your presentation about the future prospects for our discussion. I think that we will be able to deal with that in the following discussions. So I will give each of the speakers about 3 minutes each for you to give your views on how we can bring about peace in the future. So please prepare that. Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. I'd like to thank the organizers for providing such a valuable opportunity. It was a great opportunity for me to hear from the 4 neighboring countries. I don't think it's realistic for me to go through all of my slides, so I will just summarize what I prepared, and I will skip over the viewpoints that have been already mentioned by the other speakers. Now, the North Korean issue can go way back until right after the armistice. There have been numerous confrontations and conflicts. North Korea's pursuit of a nuclear program, and there have been numerous negotiations to do away with that. So during the past 3 decades or so, we have seen all of that, but I think it's time for us to really think about why all of our efforts to talk with North Korea has failed. The current peace process that has been put in place until 2018, I think has to be thought of in 2 aspects. We have to first think of what happened before 2018 and what happened after. I think in the past, what happened was that we tried to solve these issues with carrots that wouldn't last, whether it was the Geneva Agreement. What we always tried to do was give them a carrot for them giving up what they had. So North Korea was basically given a choice between nuclear weapons or survival. They were pressured to make a choice, and what was underneath that was the possibility of regime collapse. And so they ultimately turned away from the table. The second issue I think we had was that the issue of peace was not on the table. North Korea basically decided to develop its nuclear program because of the hostility it felt from the U.S. government. So that motive had to disappear for it to give up its weapons. But there have been no efforts to resolve the situation in that aspect. The joint military exercises between the ROK and U.S. has continued. And so North Korea has been given an incentive to hold on to its program to assure its security. So we had to provide North Korea with an incentive to do away with this means to security. And also, there has been some aspects with regards to its relationship with the U.S. and China. So sometimes China, in the third-party, fourth-party talks, it would engage, but in a top-down process with the U.S., China was excluded. So China was engaged sometimes, but left out in other times also. And the policies that Washington had towards North Korea was very inconsistent, fluctuating between a very strong-handed one and a lukewarm one, depending on whether the government was democratic or not. And also, we did not really focus on why North Korea wanted to hang on to its nuclear program. I think that the motive that they have, the reason that they are holding on to their program is multifaceted, but we would either neglect that or completely put that under the rug. And after 2018 and the Pyongyang Olympics, I think things changed slightly, because there was a top-down process where the summit leaders would sit down and try to solve it. It was a bilateral top-down method with either Kim Jong-un, Moon Jae-in, and Trump. They would engage in dialogue built on trust and try to solve the issue from a top-down approach. And the Panmunjom Declaration and the Singapore Joint Declaration showed that peace on the peninsula and a complete denuclearization was linked. So the building of a peace framework and denuclearization were both put on the table. So the concerns of the U.S. as well as the concerns of Pyongyang were put on the table, and they started from there, and they decided to make a swap, an exchange, action for action. So it was a dialogue that focused on reaffirming their understanding that there was a need for peace and a need for denuclearization, and that building peace and doing away with the nuclear program and conducting joint efforts to uncover the remains of the war veterans and soldiers. These were all put on the table, but what happened basically was that there was a ceiling, but they were unable to actually implement the blueprint that was laid forth because of opinion differences, differences in opinion. Another thing we need to keep into consideration is the role of Korea. When our special envoys go to North Korea, they would listen to what North Korea had to say. So Kim Jong-un would reaffirm his view that there's no need for nuclear programs if there is security assurance and so forth. And after confirming his willingness, then we would take that message to the U.S. and initiate this dialogue. So Korea played quite an important role in bringing the U.S. and ROK together. I think this was quite important compared to previous talks. But we also have to focus on why the talks were at a stalemate. I think first is because we were unable to create confidence. Although Kim Jong-un said himself that he wanted complete denuclearization, the U.S. ultimately said, we don't believe you. And although the U.S. said that we will provide you with a rosy future if you give us that security assurance, the other side also said that they did not trust the other party. So the U.S. asked for a shutdown of the nuclear program as well as missile launches, and this was a precondition for the U.S. providing their security assurance. So because of this precondition, the U.S. ultimately mistrusted the intentions of North Korea and vice versa. If you move on to the 5th slide of my presentation, could you please put this up? The next is the issue of internal protests against this top-down approach within Korea. As we saw with the talks with Mr. Bolton, U.S. officials, including Bolton, continued to take issue with this process, and it was ultimately the high-level officials that put a brake on the top-down approach pursued by Mr. Trump. And not only was there some backlash within North Korea, but also within the South Korean public, there were some different views. There was actually an opinion that the Yongbyon facilities will be closed down and that the liaison offices will be opened, and also that some of the sanctions will be lifted. And so there was a temporary agreement towards Hanoi, but then there was an additional condition that 5 facilities, including Yongbyon, to be closed down, and this led to an entanglement which ultimately broke down the talks at Hanoi. So there were internal voices of dissonance within the 3 individual parties, which led to these issues. And also, like I said earlier, the Panmunjom declaration was reaffirmed in the following talks, which meant that the North and South basically set a general direction and had various principles of how to move forward, and that this would be implemented in their talks with the U.S. But this broke down in Hanoi, which meant that both the North and South could not trust the U.S. anymore. This eroded the 2 Koreas' trust towards Washington, and this has led to the certain issues that we are seeing right now. I also think that that process could have continued further, but as was mentioned, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the heightened hegemony between the U.S. and China, which meant that the international community could not lend a hand in furthering the process. So then in the future, how should this be resolved? Well, now the U.S. has a new administration, and thankfully, Biden has mentioned that he will continue with a coordinated and practical policy in dealing with North Korea. But there are about 40 to 60 nuclear warheads in North Korea. And if you take that into consideration, we come to the conclusion that the conditional negotiations that we had with North Korea did not work. So it should be done in method of disarmament or arms control before we move on to an absolute or ultimate denuclearization. Also, I mentioned the lack of a implementing roadmap, and that was because there was no common understanding about what the end state would be. And also, in our process of exchanging the interim mileposts, the related parties did not come up with an understanding. So in this aspect, we have come up with the proposal of end-of-war declaration. In the past, the end-of-war declaration was actually one of the preconditions that we would put forth towards North Korea. If you permanently do away with the Yongbyon facility, they said that they would close that down if the U.S. provided them with substantial security assurance. But if Yongbyon is closed down, the U.S. would declare the end of war. But now they have turned that around by saying that the declaration of end of war could be brought forward. And they are trying to use that declaration as kind of a catalyst to galvanize the talks once again. And because Trump is no longer in power and President Moon will also be out of the picture next year, Kim Jong-un may end up as in a difficult position with none of the players in place. So that's why they are trying to drive this current declaration. But what's important is it shouldn't be used as a photo op. There needs to be other matching measures, such as doing away with the joint U.S. and ROK military drills, as well as other such efforts, material efforts, that the U.S. and Korea should put forth. So North Korea wants to declare the end of war while it partially has its warheads, which I believe that the U.S. and Korea can't accept. And so with regards to the sequence or the timing and conditions is very sensitive, because we have to think about when we will be making this declaration, under which conditions. And I think that there are some differing views on how to go about this, depending on which side you come from. But what we should do is, first of all, come up with an implementing roadmap. And after doing that, you should make a decision on when you will declare the end of war. And we also need to think of a scenario when the parties are unable to declare end of war. I don't think we could just leave things as it is. This is just a personal view, but I think that we should focus more on the normalization of relations. In 1992, Korea and China normalized its diplomatic relations, and we have come to a very good situation, I believe. And also between Japan and the Soviet Union, there was a non-aggression treaty, and they have been able to maintain a favorable relationship. So North Korea currently is isolated with no such relationships with Japan, for instance. So perhaps we could bring about denuclearization by starting with normalization of diplomatic ties. Now then, what should the Korean government do? I think I'd like to pick that off to continue with that issue in the later discussions.
Thank you very much, President Ko, for your presentation. I am the moderator, but as a moderator, I'd like to make some comments. So right now, there's no denuclearization talks between the U.S. and the DPRK, so there's a stallment on the Korean Peninsula. And if I may try to briefly summarize the situation, there were inter-Korean summits and there were summits between the U.S. and DPRK, which were all initiated and facilitated by President Moon. So there was a Singapore summit, and at the summit there was a talks about diplomatic ties, normalization, and there will be denuclearization. These were the promises made in Singapore. However, as President Ko mentioned, North Korea did not live up to its promises. Immediately after the Singapore summit, they actually did make some effort. So they returned the remains, and also they dismantled the launching site. So initially, the North Korea did make some efforts, but there was no reward coming from the U.S. So North Korea went back to its previous position. And the precondition for such diplomatic discussions would be the suspension of the military exercises, and then there will be no long-range missiles stationed in South Korea. However, even though there's no talks for denuclearization, for more than 3 years, for almost 3 years, North Korea has not conducted any nuclear tests. However, President Trump, after the Singapore agreement, there was no action taken by the U.S. to fulfill its promises. The U.S. economy is 600 times bigger than that of North Korea, and North Korea has, let's say, 30 nuclear warheads, but the U.S. has many more nuclear warheads. And for the U.S., they say that denuclearization is a key priority for the U.S. However, in reality, the U.S. president made a promise to North Korea, and North Korea kept some of their promises. However, the U.S. did not do anything to fulfill their promises. So Kim Jong-un says that he cannot trust the U.S. anymore. And Biden is now saying that they will engage in a dialogue with North Korea without any preconditions. But Kim Jong-un is not able to trust the U.S. because of the past experiences. So Kim Jong-un would say that the U.S. has to do something, has to show something, has to do something before North Korea can agree to have a dialogue with the U.S. And so in the situation, President Moon, being sandwiched between the two and being in a very difficult situation, went to New York and attended the UN General Assembly. And President Moon had this intention of facilitating a dialogue. So it was not even a peace treaty, but just an end-of-war declaration. And that was what President Moon proposed. Then that's where we are right now. So after this very short summary of what has happened recently, I'd like to ask you this question. For an end-of-war declaration to happen, what should be done? And what is the meaning of this end-of-war declaration? And how can we restore peace on the Korean Peninsula? This is a rather big question. So Professor Kim Donggil, there is a question to Professor Kim on the YouTube channel. You said that Chinese scholars are saying that we need to accept North Korea as a nuclear state. But in Korea, this is something that we cannot accept in Korea, because North Korea as a nuclear state cannot be a good party for negotiation. Then we may just need to wait for the North Korean regime to collapse, or what can we do? And maybe the only way to achieve denuclearization is to induce a collapse of the regime. But is that what you mean? So that's the question. And there is a question to President Ko. Depending on the government orientation, the North Korean policies have been changing. But rather, regardless of the political orientation, there should be a continuation or sustainability of the North Korean policies. So maybe people from the different political parties may need to get together and come up with a bigger direction, policy direction for North Korea. So that was a question to President Ko. We are running quite behind schedule, so I'd like to ask each speaker 3 minutes. Within 3 minutes, please share with you your comments. First of all, I'd like to invite Ms. Lee for 3 minutes.
So I'll just say that I think that there are three things that are needed, that three things that the next administration will need to keep in mind, and that is to exercise patience, persistence, and partnership. We need to recognize that Kim Jong-un may have his own timetable, particularly in 2022, which is a significant year in the North Korean calendar, and to exercise patience. I think in terms of persistence and patience, resisting the urge to respond rashly to North Korean actions. So some people call this strategic patience. I do think that trying to play down the impact that those provocations have is important as well. And in partnership, really shoring up alliances, finding common ground among stakeholders in the region, working with the United States, of course, with countries in the Indo-Pacific, Japan, and as well as with Russia and China to find common ground on when it comes to North Korea. I think, yeah, I think that that's it. Patience, persistence, and partnership.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Jin Lee. Next, I'm going to invite Professor Donggil Kim from China. So you may remember the question to you and also the overall question. So please go ahead. So the recognition of North Korea as a nuclear state or not, that's not the big question. But in order to achieve denuclearization, there should be a dialogue. That is what the Chinese government is thinking. Other than dialogue, there's no other way, because other than the dialogue, there's no alternative, and dialogue is the only way, and the only option. And also, including the nuclear issues. How can we achieve stability on the Korean Peninsula, whether such stability is in the interest of the U.S. or in the interest of China? I think this is a more fundamental question that we need to consider. Of course, stability on the Korean Peninsula is likely to be in the interest of China much more than in the interest of the U.S. because China needs stability on the Korean Peninsula because China is a neighboring country. But when you think about the U.S., I wonder how serious they are and how much they think about the need for stability on the Korean Peninsula and whether they think that this is in line with their interests. It's been more than 70 years since the end of the Korean War. And for any matters related to the Korean Peninsula, we should not talk to the U.S. first before we make any decisions. We should be able to make decisions on our own. And this is something that President Moon was trying, but it was not successful. So going forward, I think that the Korean government has to be more strong and more independent in deciding on matters related to the Korean Peninsula. As I'm serving as the director of the Center for Korean Peninsula Studies, I often meet with people from North Korea, and they would say that there are these agreements made at the Panmunjom, and there were these agreements made between the two Koreas during the summit meetings. And these open remarks by South Korea, why is it that these words are not kept? And why is it that these agreements are not implemented? It is because there is a opposition from the U.S. And so I would like to argue that the two Koreas, especially the Republic of Korea, has to be more independent. And in the urgent tasks that Professor ZHEBIN mentioned in his presentation, these urgent tasks are exactly what we have in mind in China. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Kim.
다음으로는 이찬호 선생님.
Next, I'd like to invite Professor Lee. I think I asked this earlier. We need peace policy because North Korea has a nuclear program, but the Korean government needs to be more proactive. You mentioned this, and I asked whether this could be implemented more practically. Yes, thank you. Because of the time constraint, I'll be very brief. The Korean government basically needs to maintain its alliance with the U.S., but at the same time, it also needs to have the right to self-determination with regards to military defense. And only when they have this kind of a military determinism will North Korea accept South Korea as a counterpart for negotiations. So we need to enhance our power politics and show that we have military determinism. And when we show this, I think we will be able to create a true peace process. And this could be a great tool for us. Only when North Korea views South Korea as a counterpart will we be able to engage in real dialogue, which will lead to a six-party talks, but it will be a 2+4 with the two Koreas in the center with the four neighboring countries. But the precondition, once again, is for South Korea to have military determinism and be able to deal with North Korea separately from other neighboring parties. So I think this kind of a framework needs to be in place. And lastly, the new government, well, we've talked a lot about new frameworks, but the two parties need to assure security as well as livelihood. So North Korea should assure security to South Korea as well, and vice versa. So both Koreas will be assuring each other's safety, each other's security. And within this kind of a framework, I believe that there will be a foundation for exchange and economic development surrounding the borders and the DMZ. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Mr. Lee. It was a very creative insight that you provided us, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
이제
Next, I'm going to invite Professor ZHEBIN for his final comments within 3 minutes.
Thank you. I would like to turn to the very important remark by President of Korea National Unification Institute, Mr. Ko. He said that it is unclear what will be end results of our efforts. And it's very important because many politicians, scholars, experts in United States, in Republic of Korea, and in Japan also believe that unified Korea should be a member of trilateral political military alliance, United States, Korea, Japan, with American troops on its territory. But such vision would hardly satisfy Moscow and Beijing. Both countries will perceive such alliance as a deterrence, especially in view of deployment of American missile defense system on the territory of Republic of Korea. And I think that Koreans should understand that friendship with one great power, which is across the ocean, against two other great powers who are across the river, it will not bring peace and tranquility to Korean soil. It is already hindering this unification, and I think that Koreans will be safe, and unification will come much faster when there will be no threat to neighboring powers from the Korean soil. But certainly, as the situation looks like now, we see that from the Korean soil, there is a threat to our national security as well to the national security of China. When this threat disappear or will be guarantee, some guarantee that such threat will disappear, that will be a real progress for Korea unification. Thank you.
네, 재빈 선생.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Zevin. It was a very honest opinion that you shared with us. Finally, Dr. Ko, President Ko, I will give you 3 minutes. Yes, well, to respond to the question that we should have a more consistent guideline towards North Korea rather than resort to camp logic, I agree with that fully. And there are lots of channels of dialogue within Korea as we resort to various guidelines that we go forward. But these kinds of guidelines and agreements were reached in the private sector, not between the governments. There were words that we use to point fingers, saying that you are from the liberal camp, you are on the left, you are on the right. And I still think that when we discuss the end of war declaration, we have various conflicts internally because there are some forces that want to maintain the status quo and those that want to change the status quo. And I believe that there is a logic of force, a logic that wants to maintain this kind of a strength. The current system has consolidated over the years. And there are also dynamics with the international community, as well as the US-China hegemony. And so the situation is very complex. So even if South Korea wants to maintain its independence and go its own way, it's not easy because we are swayed this way and that. And in the past, there was a bipartisan agreement. And that, I think, is a good example of how we can make this possible. But when we go into the different camps and start pointing fingers and dividing lines, it becomes very difficult. I think the next government, focusing solely on the nuclear issue, you have to first decide whether you take the nuclear program as a given, or do you choose to move towards denuclearization by resorting to the previous action for action method. Some people say that we need a agreement to share the nuclear program or so forth, but realistically, these kinds of strategic methods are quite unrealistic, such as strategic nuclear programs, I think, can't be possible in this kind of a situation when we have an agreement, a military agreement with the US. And so in order for us to make sure that the current efforts aren't reverted, we have to at least reaffirm the principles and direction of the Biden administration. And in the time that we have left, because we have this ceiling at least over our heads, we need to make sure that the next government moves towards and implement the blueprint. I think that's all we can do. Yes, thank you, Mr. Ko.
So we heard from the 5 speakers for their final remarks. They gave us the assessment of the Korean Peninsula situations and what kinds of efforts need to be made by the next government in Korea. I like to also thank the audience and also those who are watching the session online on the YouTube. Thank you very much for your interest and your participation. So we would like to conclude the parallel session 1, and there are some housekeeping announcements, I understand. So with this, we would like to conclude the parallel session 1 of the DMZ International Forum on the PC economy. Once again, thank you very much, the moderator and the speakers. And I would also like to thank the participants in the audience, both online and on-site audience. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you.